All right, welcome to another FinTech Surge Advanced Team conversation hosted by John Lillywhite. Today we're joined by Gabrielle Incerillo.
Hi, Gabrielle. Thanks for joining us today. So your job title is Head of Market Development, Financial Technology and Innovation at the Financial Services Regulatory Authority. It's a big job title. What does it involve?
It's just a long job title. It's a long job title. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time, to have a chat and all. But yes, so I'm currently the head of market development within the FinTech team of ADGM. So ADGM, Abu Dhabi Global Market, is an international financial center that is made up of 3 independent authorities, completely separate. So we have a registration authority, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, which is where I sit, which licenses all sorts of financial institutions, fintech firms, everything to do with finances, and an independent court called the ADGM courts. And essentially, we are a zone where we have our own legislation, our own jurisdiction, and our own laws based on English common law in order to have the best international practices for business. We're based out of Abu Dhabi on Al Maria Island.
Great. Okay, so thanks for that short introduction to ADGM. We'll go into that a little bit later, I guess. First question, more about you. So what's your background? How did you get into kind of financial services and fintech? And what was your experience before you came to Abu Dhabi in the UAE? And what are the kind of things you're interested in working on now?
Thanks for that. Well, when it comes down to it, I guess, I don't think anybody sets out to become a financial regulator, right? It's not really on kids' wish lists in between. I want to be a fireman. I want to be, a police officer. I want to be a marine biologist, maybe, if they're, particularly book smart. Financial regulator does not fit in there at all. But they're missing out. Honestly, they're missing out. I think we need to teach parents, to have their kids dream broader. So actually, I back in the day, I was a run-of-the-mill financial analyst, right? I started off in finance, like everybody else, in the city of London, wide-eyed. Is it wide-eyed or bright-eyed? I think it's bright-eyed. Bright-eyed, bushy hair, the whole, look, excited. And I started off working at Bloomberg, where I was actually building out financial models. And it's very, very funny, the story, because that was really my first foray into financial technology. As you may or may not know, we like to say that Bloomberg was one of the oldest fintechs in the world, right? Because they were essentially building out software and building out technology for banks, right? All banks have terminals.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, it's what they like to say.
Because, I'm from publishing, so for me, Bloomberg is always, Bloomberg, the news website. But I'm vaguely aware they have a role in financial markets because of the TV channel, but I didn't know about the terminals. That's interesting.
Actually, they have a very, very big role. So much so that when the terminals go out, there have been moments when the data centers have gone down very, very momentarily, and it's essentially caused outages for all of the city. It's caused outages for all of Wall Street. Nobody can function. Wow. You can't buy, sell bonds because nobody has information coming in. So basically, they're an information provider, whether it's,
right.
whether it's financial information being come in, whether it's news being, sent out, etc. They're this nexus. And I was working on this project called Enhanced Fundamentals at the time, which was about, reworking the financials of big stock listed companies. And we went to present to a bank that I won't name, but it was a big bank in Canary Wharf. And, one of their really higher ups was looking at this project, and the first thing he mentions, he says, wow, this is great. I'm going to get to be able to really cut down on my first year analysts. I love what you guys are doing in fintech now. I'd never heard that. This was in late 2014, early 2015 for me. Nobody was talking about fintech that much. They had started, but it was still, a little bit niche. And that got me really, really thinking. I'm like, okay, what is this? What's happening? And so I ended up leaving Bloomberg to go to Citibank to work with a Citi FinTech team out of Miami, where I started working on implementing fintech solutions into the bank in order to better our processes. And that got me a little bit more delving into the whole topic about, okay, are fintechs out there to be competitors? Are they there to help out? what are fintech's role going to do? And keep in
Right.
mind that this was in, I think, so this was about 2015, 2016 at that point. And
Right.
Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase had just gone on the record saying that, oh, fintechs were here to stay and they were out for our bottom line. So a lot of banks were starting to get a little bit edgy, a little bit worried. And that's when the industry blew up. Suddenly VCs were, you know, saying, okay, the next big thing is fintech. We have to invest in fintech. And so I was able to repurpose my banking fintech experience and jumped over to the venture capital industry, where I spent the next, I guess, 4 years investing in fintech and insurtech startups for a VC called Plug and Play, so a seed stage investor based out of California.
Yeah. You know, Plug and Play. They're in the Middle East quite a lot, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Well, when I joined, we didn't have any fintech offices outside of California. And I was lucky in the fact that I was able to help lead that expansion. So starting off with an office in Paris, which was our first hub, our first fintech hub, then an office in Frankfurt, an office in Amsterdam, one in Barcelona. And of course, my favorite office was always the office we had here that we launched in Abu Dhabi. So I was the director of fintech for EMEA for Plug and Play. And I was able to then leverage that relationship and leverage that, let's say, enjoyment of the ecosystem here to jump ship and join the regulator here.
Super interesting. So thanks for that background. There's a lot to discuss there. But I think first we should possibly start with kind of just a retrospective on how much things have changed. So I guess you kind of entered the market, it sounds like, or began learning about fintech in you know, around 2014, you mentioned. And my experience, you know, turning up in London as a young graduate was pretty much the crash, 2008. You know, everything blows apart. Not only was it the crash though, but it was, you know, being kind of one of those history grads that hangs out with other history grads and is at law school and doesn't really like a lot of the guys in the financial industries over in Canary Wharf or Canada Water, because frankly, you know,
they don't like themselves.
I know that. So there's that. There was that.
Or each other. So don't worry.
Culture. So, but I guess what's happening is a cultural shift. So at that time in London, you know, you kind of, if you were working in the financial industries, it was great. Everyone understood why you were doing it, but there was kind of a hint of an apology there, you know, or kind of a brash, this is why I'm doing it. But I think, and it wasn't really understood either, you know, it was kind of, what do you guys do all day? But what's kind of happened is, okay, we've gone through the financial crisis and you know, because of that, and because I think a lot of other things, there's been this ground discussion around, you know, the economy and how the economy works and how finance works. That's really, in a way, is generational. But then what's also happened is you've had technology kind of seeping into so many markets, but increasingly the financial markets too. And I've been reading recently about how there's a lot of, you know, people relatively senior in the tech industry in Silicon Valley and in London who aren't looking to move now to the big tech companies, but are looking to move into kind of this hybrid relationship between emerging technology and banking and financial institutions, because they understand this is where a lot of the, you know, macroeconomic shifts are happening. So suddenly, whereas, you know, what all those years ago, kind of 2008, around that time, working in financial industries was, you know, seen as very old fashioned, not really the future, kind of, you know, something to do then. Now you've almost got the shift where people who were previously a bit, you know, unsure about that environment, didn't see it as that dynamic, didn't see it as kind of, you know, emerging as the tech industry, and now reevaluating financial services and thinking, hey, you know, there's change happening here. And I know from a previous discussion on DFSA and what's happening in DIFC, that when you go there now, you've got like the FinTech Hive guys who are all, you know, walking around in sneakers and talking, using the language of the startup industry to discuss financial innovation, but they're also sitting down with regulators and trying to understand what the banks want. There's also a weird kind of merger between those two cultures. And of course, that wasn't there about 5 years ago. So your story kind of captures that arc in a way, that trend that kind of reflects this wider shift in financial technology. What do you think about that? Do you think that sounds accurate?
So I think what we're seeing is that fundamentally, so back in the day, you know, when you had people who were very ambitious, right? You had all sorts of different types of talents. At some point, you would end up with people going into, let's say, law, or, you know, they'd go into banking, they'd go into these sort of, you know, spick and span type professions that are quite clear cut, right? And then we had the emergence of, you know, companies like Google, you know, companies like PayPal, these big companies, right, that started really putting out. And suddenly we started seeing this talent being pushed out, let's say, towards the big tech companies, right? And they attracted people, you know, with this promise of free lunches, and you can wear sneakers to the office, and, you know, you can be yourself and sell and be, you know, don't have to compress yourself into a suit every day and fit a role and be just a number like that. And that was a lot of the, I guess, a lot of the attraction at the time, because it was so different, right? And evidently the fintech, well, not the fintech industry, but the financial industry was like, first like, okay, what's happening? And slowly they started seeing that they were starting to get maybe less and less talent coming through, right? It really was seeping off to other places. But then there also came the realization that financial institutions as they are not going to remain just, I don't want to say paper-based institution, static, yes, static, but also I want to say not just paper-based institutions, because that's what we have this idea of, right? Banks are highly sophisticated, nonetheless. Right. They're highly sophisticated with a huge amount of technology that runs, because evidently if you can't access your money, what's happening? The world is going to stop, right? And what fintech was able to do was able to bring back and push up a lot of this very interesting part of the financial industry, which I think got drowned out by this vision we had of, you know, aggressive investment bankers, or, you know, dudes, you know, having too many pints in Canary Wharf and just being, you know, loud and raucous and just, you know, putting on. And it really became much more of a, okay, I'm here to do this because I want to, you know, make maybe finances better, make place better. And that's a shift we're currently starting to find that's happening.
Right. So what about your experience? I mean, one, how did you kind of move from venture capital into regulation? But also secondly, how does the experience working in Paris, Luxembourg, Barcelona, European kind of discussion, how does that compare to the discussion that you are exposed to in Abu Dhabi, but also increasingly, because we're slightly closer to the East, we hear the discussions coming out of China and Singapore and some other countries. Because you've got this interesting global perspective. So question one, VC to regulation, and then question two, how does that filter into your kind of experience in multiple markets?
So the VC to regulation one is a good one, because it actually seems like a completely out there jump. Who does that, right? But it actually makes perfect sense. When you're investing in new technology, oftentimes you find yourself trying to implement this technology, or at least helping the founders that you invested in trying to implement them within banks. And you realize that you're operating in a gray zone. It's not even that, you know, it's black and white and they're on the black side and they're doing something bad. There simply aren't rules in place to allow them to use this technology, or that would even punish them if they did. It's a gray zone. And evidently, when you work with financial institutions, they're very, very careful with regulation and compliance and such, and they don't want to tick off their regulators, right? It's especially after the crash, and especially after all the names that were slinged at them. So what happens is that if you really want your fintechs to grow, and if you want to be a value-add investor and actually provide value to, apart from just, you know, cold hard cash, which they can get from anyone, right? It's not that difficult if you have a great solution. One of the means of doing that is basically going with them and helping them out. And I started becoming increasingly interested in how to speak to regulators. So whether it was how to speak with, you know, them in the UK, in Paris, so in France, whether it's in Luxembourg or Brussels, for instance, and going to speak with them on, okay, we have this new solution. Currently, we think it can be used, but we know there are current issues with, let's say, data privacy laws that might not, work at the moment? Can we have more clarity on the laws you wrote? That sort of thing. So it was really this idea of learning to speak to regulators and keeping this dialogue open. And when we opened up, when Plug and Play opened up the office, so us at the time, we did it in partnership with ADGM, so here in Abu Dhabi. And it was really a wonderful experience because ADGM was a young regulator. They only opened up in 2015, so young, agile, building up their regulation from scratch. And they very much do listen to companies. They listen to companies, they listen to financial institutions, they listen to startups, even if they're not licensed as part of them, because they want to know if the market reality fits the regulation that they're writing. And that's fascinating. It's fascinating because it's a very, very comprehensive approach. It's about maintaining this dialogue. It's not about having this issue of power play that you often get in older jurisdictions, such as in Europe, where the regulator sits above and won't give feedback down. This happens in many European countries, for instance. It's like a black box that you don't know what's happening in there.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Exactly. ADGM was very open to use the market reality to build regulation that makes sense. And so eventually, after working with so many regulators and investing in these startups, I started feeling that, okay, if we're really going to push the fintech industry as a whole and allow really good products and really good solutions to hit consumers, to hit the market and be used by consumers, it wasn't just enough to, be going there and putting ticket sizes in startups and hoping and maybe trying to knock on doors to help them out. Maybe I could use, my skill sets to help a market as a whole. And ADGM were very, very, kind of welcoming me in to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that it does make total sense within the financial services, because it doesn't matter how great your startup is in that industry. If you don't have the regulation or the kind of ecosystem to be able for your app to be legal and work, you're never going to get anywhere. So totally understand how the VC and also the entrepreneur end needs to kind of also be in sync with the regulation, what works and what doesn't, and as you said, what reflects market behavior. But that's probably a good segue into trying to understand what the Abu Dhabi global market is kind of, and what it's trying to achieve. There's lots of innovation taking place in financial markets all over the world. And it seems like for Abu Dhabi, ADGM is positioned to try and understand that and take advantage of it. So kind of what are the most exciting or important things it's working on? And how does it see its role within the wider UAE?
So what is very, very nice about ADGM is evidently, we're structured on English common law, which means that any of the regulations that are written or basically the frameworks that are published and sent out, they can, if other regulators want to take a look and have a look, they can evidently have a look. And if they're inspired by our best practices, they can evidently, follow suit and actually take that, which is nice because it means that
so interesting. Yeah.
If you actually do it right, if you do it right the first time, it can actually follow through and influence, let's say, regulators across the world in order to create a much more cohesive regulatory environment across jurisdiction, which would be ideal because no fintech startup wants to join an ecosystem while they will be blocked only there and they can't expand or they can't scale or they can't go away. And the interesting thing about Abu Dhabi as an ecosystem, because I think we mentioned, earlier that there was eventually, I've been in a few different ecosystems. So I've seen how different jurisdictions try to sell their startup ecosystem to fintechs. And especially when it comes down to it, we always ask, okay, everybody, what makes a really, really good startup friendly environment, right? Everybody wants to be the next Silicon Valley. They want to be the hub. But fundamentally, what is that? Is it, talent? Is it access to funding? Is it cheap cost of living to allow people to, have lower salaries and maintain all their equity? Is it having, a great market where you have access to stakeholders? Is it a stable regulator that's going to listen? Or maybe if it doesn't listen, at least it's very, very stable and you know what rules to follow it on. What are really the ingredients of making a really good startup ecosystem? And different countries have done different things. Paris, for instance, has really, really invested on the strength of their talent. They have great engineering schools. So they've been pushing startups like nobody's business in the AI, tech space, machine learning, really, you know, more of the hard tech front. Places like, for instance, Amsterdam have really pushed the fact that they're a very dynamic ecosystem, right? With a big amalgamation of big companies, but also small enough that there's a good dialogue. Places like Luxembourg that you mentioned the term Luxembourg, is heavily punching above its weight in terms of geographic size. It's tiny, right?
Makes sense.
Tiny.
Yeah.
But it's serving
capital.
basically all of Europe. Yeah, but it's basically serving all of Europe in terms of financial services and such. But one of the things they're done really well is because they're such a small city state per se.
Yeah.
Everybody knows each other. So you can meet the prime minister in the line at the supermarket, which means that ideas get across very, very quickly. Everybody knows each other.
Quickly.
Everybody knows the projects that are being worked on. And so things can be done rapidly and in a very non-confrontational manner. Abu Dhabi and, you know, the UAE as a whole, right, is special in the fact that it has a lot of top-down government support, which you don't get in a lot of places, actually, right? The governments here, whether it is in Dubai or it is in Abu Dhabi, is heavily investing in the startup culture. It's heavily investing in upskilling its citizens. It's heavily investing in creating a really nice environment. And as well as government entities, they're also pushing to have that dialogue take place. And so that really makes for a nice, comfortable, I guess, startup environment where founders can essentially come here and really give it a good shot and really focus on what's important, which is actually proving that their product works in the market. And that actually leads me to your next question, which was, okay, so what ADGM is up to and what ADGM, you know, is looking to do in the market, right? And I'm super excited by this, actually. Like, this is the big thing for me. So for the last few years, regulators have had something called regulatory sandboxes, right? So it's basically these sandboxes, which are a basic, you know, space or framework where rules don't apply anymore, or they apply, but you're gonna not be punished if you break the rules because you're doing it, you know, in a transparent manner, right? And it's worked to some extent, right? It's been a really good way for regulators to have a look at new technologies, see whether it fits into their rules, see if they have to make changes, etc. Now, companies and banks and things like that, when they work with fintechs and they work with startups, they also have something called a sandbox often, or they've built it themselves. But for them, it's normally, if they do it, it's a little section of their data center or their IT stacks where they have pre-production environments to test whether these startups actually work. They actually say what's written on the tin. Because we all know that startups can claim everything they want in the world, but do they actually work? It has to be proven, right?
Yeah.
And as the regulator here, ADGM had this wonderful idea, right, and really phenomenal, of building something called a digital lab. So the idea was it would be essentially a completely digital infrastructure that we've had built for us. So we wholly own the product, which would allow startups to connect to Digital Lab, basically display their APIs, display their products, have their APIs certified, and would also allow financial institutions to connect into the Digital Lab as well. And we actually provide containers and infrastructure for them to test the solutions digitally in our pre-production environments.
Wow, that's super interesting. Wow. So there's a kind of digital sandbox, and presumably what you're saying is the entrepreneur or the individuals working on a fintech solution can send their code or their API to this sandbox, and then the other end, the B2B relationship, the bank or the financial institution, can partner with them or experiment with that API or that code to see how viable it is within their own networks. And then presumably they can tweak and edit and discuss as required. And everyone retains their own IP, but it's a great way to kind of test what's possible.
Exactly. And they do it in a secure, neutral environment that's basically overseen by us as the regulator, who are essentially a not-for-profit. We're not here to make money off any of this. We're just here to make basically the ecosystem grow. And in order to make it all the more beneficial to everybody, it's open to everyone. So it's not even just open to UAE startups or UAE financial institutions. We can have startups from across the world, anywhere in the world. So fintechs can come and connect to the digital lab and basically display their products to financial institutions from also across the world, which are looking to see what's there, and then they can connect. So that essentially means that we're building this digital marketplace that's then connected to an actual digital testing ground, where the stuff can actually be looked at and connected and trialed and seen if it's viable. And the reason we did this is because we didn't want to just help ourselves. We wanted to just help everybody. So one of the good and interesting things this means is not only does it mean that the banks feel more safe and secure, it accelerates their procurement processes because they're not doing anything in-house, internally at all. They're just testing things outside in a safe environment. But it also means that if you're a financial institution, I don't know, in a different country, and you're not sure if you're maybe, in a regulatory gray zone, what you can do is also ask or invite your regulator to join our digital sandbox to have a look, so they can go and look under the hood and say, okay, what's happening here, and should we allow it in our home jurisdiction? So we want this to be a tool for everybody, financial institutions, fintechs, and regulators, so that we can have more and more solutions and fintech products that hit the market and actually get to consumers, which is what we want.
That's kind of fascinating. I mean, there's a big kind of discussion on globalization there, and how increasingly, emerging technology applications are kind of pushing globalization in reverse. So emerging economies like the UAE are actually coming up with case studies that are filtering out and going back and influencing the older, in some ways, more mature, but sometimes less agile markets. But on a kind of separate discussion, what you've really brought up is a collaboration between government and entrepreneurs and regulators to kind of seed some of these new ideas. And I think that's also the way technology and a wider conversation is shifting too. 5-6 years ago in the Middle East and in particular, but also in London and the US, it was always about entrepreneurship, the individual entrepreneur. The front of the magazine was the entrepreneur. Most of our discussions around technology were around buzzwords, or the idea of the kind of almost hero figure building something new. And now you kind of have this understanding that government is also a focal point for pushing out innovation, and that collaboration and support from government might not just mean passing some laws that help SMEs. It actually means a more active role in partnering with ecosystems to create things like you've discussed, such as the digital lab, or to kind of create conditions where entrepreneurs can gain access to the banks. So, I mean, in your experience, is government also becoming an increasingly important stakeholder, not just in creating the conditions, but in working alongside technologists and new institutions in birthing some of these new ideas?
So I think the government was always important. They always were. It's just that, like you mentioned, we didn't want to hear about them. When it comes down to it, we still really, really like the myth of the founder, that one solo hero that's going out there and causing havoc, causing chaos, and, building a multi-million billion empire. And, that's what we like. We don't want to hear about all the meetings that took place behind closed doors with different government entities and different government agencies. We don't want to think about the policy experts that sat down and looked at this and then said, okay, what is the risk to people? Is there a risk? What is the benefit? And did it actually sat down and did a cost benefit analysis of changing this legislation? Because it's not sexy, right? It doesn't make, the cover of Forbes. It doesn't make, policy analyst does social cost benefit analysis on the effects of changing, law 3B4 in order to allow payments, to go through, for instance, Facebook. That's not the story we want people like to consume. But there's so many people in so many different government entities and agencies, and just across, whether it's also investors that are working at night trying to, get their founders connected to the right people, right? That it takes a village to create these success stories. And one thing about the Abu Dhabi ecosystem and just the UAE as a whole, because ultimately, we are here ADGM, but we're here to support the UAE, right? It's not, it is that, having this government understanding and having this government dialogue that's consistently there and consistently open allows us to get that information out and actually be able to support these founders the best we can. Because as a regulator, what is your role? Is it just to say no? No, it's not just to say no. Your role is to get out good products to people, right?
Right.
And that means supporting the right success stories.
Yeah, and with that in mind, maybe we should go into kind of some of the less glamorous detail on some of the things that ADGM does every day. So I've got a couple of baskets. So we wanted to ask you a bit about digital banking, a bit about some of what's going on in FinTech, and mostly this idea of RegTech and financial regulation. But just in terms of digital banking, because I know now we're talking about FinTech, and I don't know too much of the history on this, but digital banking popped up on all of us almost unawares. It just kind of made sense, and we already had so many apps on our phone. But as you said, it kind of does show that there are so many backends and so much kind of data flowing through these banks, millions of transactions, I'm sure every day or every hour. I don't know the figures, that banks have been crossing over to digital for quite some time. So kind of what is ADGM working on in particular in the digital market? I know, we've got, I've read about it trying to help SMEs. I know there's a digital banking framework, and there's also some discussion on SME lending and transactional banking. But just a short summary of kind of why digital banking is important and what are some of the things that are being looked at.
So I think ultimately, and actually there's two points to my answer. One is going to be about definitely digital banking and broader open finance. And the second point will be how we're trying to help the SME ecosystem, which is actually also very exciting. It doesn't sound very glamorous right now, but it's also very exciting.
I actually find that very interesting because obviously for SMEs, that's critical. So, yeah.
So digital banking is evidently very, very important. And we have, for instance, different licensed digital banks within the ADGM. But it goes further than that, because digital banking is just connecting to your bank and then getting information. Ultimately, you want to get to a point where consumers are going to be able to access at a touch of a button all their different financial type information, whether that's random payment wallets that they have, whether it's retirement accounts, whether it's investments, whether it's their day-to-day banks. And that falls under the idea of open finance, right? Not just to do with banking, because there are evidently entities that deal with payments and such that aren't necessarily banks, deposited banks that take in cash. And so we recently put out an open finance framework to basically allow all these different fintechs that provide these solutions and also other companies to connect under the ADGM framework to be able to provide consumers with all this information so that they can aggregate and also better understand their financial situations. So that's quite interesting. And we're quite excited about putting out the open finance framework, mostly because it means that it's going to give better control to consumers, right? If you're able to have access to all your financial sources, not just your banks and such, you have a better picture of what's happening around. And that sort of pushes more for financial literacy. So it's great on the literacy part. It's also great on the financial inclusion part, because we're able to connect to, people who may not have access to all the classical digital banking or traditional banking products. And that's one of basically the main points that we want, is to allow a cohesive environment and a holistic approach to all of finance in general. So not just digital banking, but eventually digital banking is important just because it's, it's snazzier, it's, easier, it's easier to have access to, and that falls under, digital banking and open finance, and also just data protection, right? So that everything falls in such a way as, consumers are protected, consumers are safe, and consumers have all the information that they need. Now, going to the SME landing part, which is, I think it's awesome. We're currently in the process of launching an SME platform, and that is exactly what it says on the tin. Essentially, the idea is that the backbone of a really good economy, an economy that can get past, financial crisis, that can get past pandemic crises, that can get past all sorts of shocks and waves and such, is that they have a good SME sector, right? It can't all just be large corporations, right? It has to have, a plethora of different types of SMEs and such. So that's mark of a great and fairly, robust economy. Now, one of the issues that we found is that it can be a little bit difficult, and this isn't a problem for the UAE, it's a problem as a whole across the world. This is a world problem. It is hard for SMEs to get lending, right? It just is, because either they're, let's say, startups. I mean, we call them startups, but ultimately they fall under the SME category, right? They're startups and they haven't been in business long enough to provide all the information they need to banks in order to get a loan. Also, if you are, for instance, a startup, you might not necessarily want to always go to investors to raise money. Maybe you're really, really confident in your product and you actually just need a bridge loan for a few months, right? Because there was slightly less sales because of, let's say, an exogenous shock to the economy. And you don't want to go and give up 15% equity to investors. But still, if you don't have the information, it can be hard to get that loan. And banks on their side, understandably, they have less of a risk appetite for small companies. So small companies, SMEs that will probably not have the best return on their investment. Like, they're not going to jack up the rates anyway. Usually it's smaller amounts. It's not the multi-million dollars, dirhams, euros of trade financing they're used to with large corporations. And so all in all, there's a bit of a disconnect. And, you get great SMEs that just don't get access to lending. And so we're currently in the process of building out a platform to allow SMEs to basically apply to loans, connect to the various financial institutions in the UAE, apply for loans, and then we're also working to basically integrate different source of government data in order to fill up and help them out with their applications, in order to make it easier for financial institutions to be able to basically de-risk the means of lending out to SMEs. And I think I'm very excited about that, because ultimately, if SMEs have access to lending as opposed to just investments or just, extortionate rates from, money sharks, or, borrowing from family and friends, it makes it easier for people to get onto this adventure of launching their own company, launching their own startup, and it gives them the stability to actually go on and do business. And that all in a whole helps the economy. So we're really looking to do that. No. And
that
it's
sounds
a
great.
UAE initiative.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. So it's UAE wide. Yeah, definitely. I spoke to a couple of SMEs who were talking about kind of their experience during COVID-19. And one of the big things was, we're grateful to be here. It's so much better than a lot of parts of the world. But one of the hardest things is walking into a bank, because, just getting access to a credit card is hard for us. Getting loans is very difficult everywhere, as you said. But there was one lady from the banking industry who was on the call, and she said, it's actually more complicated than you think, because a lot of the banks don't actually have the auditing process or the kind of regulatory process to understand who and why they should give loans to. And it's often quite ad hoc. And that makes it even more risky than it might ordinarily be with a smaller company. So kind of the discussion was, on the one side, yeah, it's tough for the entrepreneurs, but also if you're in a bank and you have to kind of make that call, the decision-making structure is actually still quite, it's not actually set in place. So that was kind of really interesting for everyone. And I guess, that kind of service, if it's UAE wide, particularly, given the experience of the past 12 to 14 months, I can see why that would be really useful. On that note then, because there's also this new phrase that I only heard, I think late last year, which is RegTech, regulation technology. And it was fascinating, because we were talking about it in the kind of context of AI and algorithms, and the idea that actually elements of regulation, because again, you have the idea of the bureaucratic person at the desk filing in paperwork, but one of the things I was told is that the volume of transactions is now so much that it's impossible for any human being or any series of human beings to really interdict meaningfully. Therefore, you kind of need regulations that are written in code, or that are able to kind of observe some of these millions of transactions and spot patterns. And so, that was kind of the discussion I've had on RegTech in the past, what is RegTech? How is it working? You know, what is the size of the industry? Are people moving into it? What's this all about?
So I've got a new word for you if you want to just add one in there to complete your vocabulary. We also have SupTech now. So supervisory tech.
I had that one too. Right. So that what I discussed might be more subtech then, right? Because I guess it's scanning and pattern matching. So what's the difference between RegTech and subtech?
I'm not even going to answer that because then we get caught up into semantics and I don't want purists coming out after me. My DMs will be filled with hate.
Wow, it's clearly controversial. Okay, I didn't know the financial technology sector was so, yeah, good, so full of trolls, but anyway.
Oh, there is, it's like, you know, you have, startup, upstart startup versus upstart versus scale up, FinTech versus tech fin. There's a lot of you know semantics out there, but that's on the side. Yeah. That could be a whole topic for a whole conversation. What's the vocab in tech these days?
Abbreviations at the end of the interview, but yeah.
Exactly. No, but the thing about RegTech, which is fundamental, is the fact that, you know, let me take it back. People shouldn't be made to just look at, if a machine can do it better, why do we have people do it? You know, the whole point about people in general is to train them up to have value add skills that they can, you know, interact with new information, and they can think about it, and then they can, you know, really do what they're trained to do. That's the case with all regulators, people who are compliance officers, people who are overseeing, you know, different aspects of the compliance process and the supervisory process. So evidently, ideally, we would love to go down the route where, you know, we have regulatory technology that essentially, you know, really matches up with the rules. In an ideal world, all our rule books would be, you know, codified and would feed in straight into, you know, regulatory technology. And when updated, those new updates would automatically feed into all the programs and such. And it will allow compliance officers and regulators to do what they do best, which is, you know, really adapt to different changes in market and different changes in technology, which is ultimately what human beings are there to do, right? Not just do look at numbers day in, day out if we have wonderful technology that can do it. So evidently there's a really, really big push because regulatory technology can help aid compliance officers and help aid people, but can also help aid us as regulators. Because if we know that there's, you know, really great technology that's being used in this situation, then it gives us confidence and we're able to build up our rule books appropriately. And it also allows us to oversee, you know, better and more efficiently, right? So it's an exciting space. Lots of trials being done, lots of pilots being done. Eventually, one of the key components is that a lot of, let's say maybe smaller firms are currently working on upgrading their own systems in order to implement regulatory technology in. Because it comes with all these changes, right? You're not going to expect everyone to do a switch like that, and then the next day, their entire compliance staff is trained up to use RegTech technology, RegTech technology, you know, regulatory technology, and use these new softwares and able to interpret it appropriately. But the shift is very much happening, and we're really excited about how this is slowly phasing into different firms and different large corporations as they start implementing these solutions in, and what that means for us as a role, in our role as a regulator, how we can also implement, you know, these solutions into our own processes to make life easier. So it's currently a change that's happening. We're not there yet. Not everything isn't machine readable as of yet. And, you know, we have nothing to do. That's not going to happen, not anytime soon. But it's very exciting developments that are happening.
Right. And I guess just finally, what about the discussion between institutions like ADGM and the entrepreneurship and the VC kind of circuit? Because there is kind of, you know, there is an element of literacy and understanding some of these concepts. And I know that you guys have been working on something called special purpose vehicles, which many entrepreneurs might not have been too aware of until, of course, Angami listed on the NASDAQ. And then everyone in Dubai is suddenly, you know, Googling special purpose vehicles, because apparently that played a role in kind of assisting some of what they achieved. And there hasn't always been a good understanding. You know, a lot of the focus on entrepreneurs has been how to raise capital, how to, you know, pitch to investors, how to understand, equity. But what do you think in terms of education, in terms of understanding how RegTech, FinTech, things like special purpose vehicles can actually assist the growth of a company or even the growth of certain industries or ecosystems? Do you think that's something that's going to start becoming more normal, or do you think everyone's going to remain in their silos, and the financial world, as we kind of discussed back pre-2008, will remain somewhat in its silo, and the entrepreneurs will also remain, in their silo with their language? Or do you think the two are increasingly going to merge?
Very honestly, and I say this as a former investor, is if we have great founders, great entrepreneurs, the last thing on earth I'd want them to do is worry about financial regulation. I mean, they definitely should a bit, but first of all, they should really work on building a product that consumers love. First and foremost, they need product market fit. They need to have something that consumers will use, consumers will need, and that should be their priority day in, day out. And then once they have something that's amazing, that actually functions, that is a value add, that actually gives to society and is useful, that's when the regulators will come in. Because we're, like I said, the whole goal with financial regulation stuff is there to protect, but also enhance people's lives. So if there's something that's, a no-brainer, that makes sense, that makes life easier for people, we will listen. Regulators across the world will listen, right?
Okay, so
I have to ask you,
that makes total sense. But just finally, because I have to ask you based on that, what about the crypto entrepreneurs and the blockchain guys? How do they fit into all this then? Because I know regulations are improving for them, particularly in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, particularly we have an excellent, and I say this because I read it back in the days before I was at ADGM, an absolutely excellent crypto asset framework. We're currently working with a few companies which are going to come be licensed within ADGM. So we're very much, but I can't really talk about it too much. We're very much excited to welcome, crypto asset entrepreneurs to come into and be licensed by ADGM, because fundamentally, I mean, didn't we just see that Coinbase listed yesterday or a couple of days ago?
Saw that. Yeah, it was massive.
And there's much more institutional investors that are now in the space. There's a lot more crypto asset, custody solutions. It's kind of, going mainstream. So for anyone out there that's going to listen to us that has a crypto asset company and is interested, we have a crypto asset framework, and we've had one for a few years now.
I know a couple of people are looking at Abu Dhabi, actually, not just here in the UAE. But Gabriela Inderillo, thank you so much for your time today. I've never had so much fun talking about financial technologies, and I think my graduate self would have found this quite a surprising conversation, but things have changed a lot. And I think what ADGM is doing is kind of at the forefront of the economy, hopefully here, but also overseas as well. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.